the world's largest aircraft, the Hindenburg, prepares to depart for New Jersey.
The world's largest aircraft, the Hindenburg, prepares to depart for New Jersey. The last Hindenburg survivor died in 2014, but not before making a stunning confession. For 77 years, he kept quiet about what he really saw that night. His signed documents. He stayed silent. But on his deathbed, he finally broke, flamed. He revealed that multiple passengers weren't who they claimed to be. Secret agents were on board. Someone was planning to destroy the ship. The survivor's final words expose a cover-up that reaches the highest levels of government. The Hindenburg explosion was just the beginning of something much darker. The Hindenburg began as an idea born from a nation that believed the sky was theirs to conquer. Germany had been obsessed with Zeppelins for decades. And by 1936, their engineers were ready to build something bigger than anything that had ever lifted into the air. Under Dr. Hugo Eckener's guidance, the LZ-129 Hindenburg slowly took shape inside the giant shed at Friedrichshafen. When it finally rolled out, its size almost did feel real. It stretched about 245 m long, nearly 803 1/2 foot, with a diameter of 41 m. Nothing else in the world even came close. Inside its sleek duralumin skeleton were 16 huge gas cells holding almost 200,000 cub-m of lifting gas, more than 7 million cub-feet. The original plan had been to fill those cells with helium because helium didn't burn. But the United States had been the only major supplier of helium since the 1920s, and it had banned all exports back in 1925. They saw the gas as too rare and too strategically important. No exceptions were made, and certainly not for Nazi Germany. So the builders turned to hydrogen. Hydrogen lifted more, which made the ship faster, but it carried Ashadao with it because everyone knew how easily it could burn. That choice would follow the Hindenburg for the rest of its short life. Even with that risk, the finished ship felt like a floating palace. When it launched in March 1936, newspapers called it the pride of German engineering. 2 full decks were dedicated to passengers. There were 25 cabins, an elegant dining room, a spacious lounge, even a pressurized smoking room that existed only because of elaborate safety tricks to keep any flames sealed behind thick doors. Max Schultz, the bartender hired specifically for that room, stayed alert every second, making sure no cigarette or cigar wandered out. Everyone working inboard knew the unspoken truth. The ship was beautiful, but it was also fragile in a way people preferred not to think about. For a while, though, it delivered everything it promised. Ford Daimler-Benz diesel engines pushed it through the sky at about 125 km/h, around 78 mph. It could cross the Atlantic in half the time of the fastest ocean liners. In 1936 alone, it completed 17 round-trip crossings. 10 to the United States and 7 to Brazil. Each one was smooth, thousands of passengers flew safely, and the ship covered 1 million miles without a single injury. Travelers enjoyed fine meals, looked out from the long gallery windows at the curve of the clouds, and ordered cocktails from Max Schultz as if they were in a luxury hotel. People called it the last word in speed and comfort. It was the first aircraft to run regular passenger service between Europe and the Americas. For many months, the dream of airship travel seemed stronger than ever. Still, the fears never vanished. Escher had pushed hard for helium, warning that hydrogen always carried a risk no amount of skill could erase. But the Helium Control Act in the United States closed that door. Some German officials brushed the danger aside. Captain Ernst Lehmann often said with pride that the Hindenburg had operated safely for years on hydrogen. Yet even he once heard a quiet warning from an American airship supporter who told him he hoped Germany would never regret that confidence. Those words would return with terrible weight. As 1937 arrived, the Hindenburg prepared for a new season. Its first North America flight was planned for early May. By this time, Eckener had been pushed aside for political reasons, and Captain Max Puce held command. Captain Lehmann, one of the most experienced airship men in the world, joined the May flight only as an observer. He had been grieving deeply since the recent death of his young son. He carried that sorrow with him as he boarded, along with something else that troubled him. A letter had reached him warning that a bomb would destroy the ship on a future flight. It came from Milwaukee, written by someone he did not know. He did not believe it would happen, but the words disturbed him enough that he kept the letter folded in his pocket as the ship lifted off from Frankfurt. There were also 3 Luftwaffe officers on the passenger list. Major Hans Hugo Witt, Colonel Fritz Erdmann, and Lieutenant Klaus Hinkelbein traveled in civilian clothes officially to study long-range airship operations. Some people much later claimed they had a secret mission to stop a saboteur, but Witt denied this during the United States inquiry that followed the disaster. He said the only unusual thing was an extra careful baggage inspection before departure, triggered by another anonymous warning. Once the airship was in the air, no one mentioned sabotage again. Military observers had joined flights before. Sodhair presence did not raise suspicion. If anyone dangerous was on board, they stayed completely hidden. The real danger was something much larger and much quieter. The Hindenburg left Frankfurt on May 3, 1937 at 7:16 in the evening. It carried 36 passengers and 61 crew and trainees. Among them was a sharp and eager 14-year-old cabin boy named Vera France. This was only his second trip to America. Dressed in a neat uniform, he spent his time carrying coffee to officers, cleaning, and trying to prove he deserved his place on board. He had landed the job only because his older brother had whispered his name to the right person the previous autumn. Vera wanted to show that the chance had not been wasted. In the control car, he called for the engines to slow as the last adjustments began. First Officer Albert Sampt vented hydrogen from the forward cells and released water ballast to balance a slight heaviness in the tail. The ship slowly descended to about 600 feet, moving toward the handlers waiting below. At 7:21, with dusk settling in, the final steps began. Ballast had been dropped in 3 releases, together weighing about 1 cup water. When the ship reached roughly 180 feet, crewmen opened the bow hatches and threw down the thick mooring lines. First, the starboard line dropped, then the port. Ground crews grabbed the ropes and started fastening them to 2 inches. A brief sprinkle of rain began to fall. Inside the control car, Captain Puce and Captain Lehman felt a light jolt when the port line tightened too much. But they thought it was nothing more than a rope pulled too hard. They had no idea that in the tail of the Hindenburg, something far more dangerous had already begun. Only minutes later, at 7:25, the disaster arrived. Several people on the field saw a strange flutter along the top of the ship near the tail. It looked almost like a gas cell was leaking and the outer skin puffed for a moment. Navy Lieutenant R. Hankins Ward later said he saw a wave-like ripple between frames 62 and 77, right where gas cell 5 sat. Someone else thought the rear cover sagged inward near the portside engine. At the same time, a faint blue glow shimmered along the skin, likely static from thunderstorm-filled air. When the tail exploded in flames, she grabbed her 2 boys, Walter, who was 10, and Vera, who was 8, and threw them out of the window. Both survived. She tried to lift her daughter, Irene, who was 16, but could not manage it. With the fire closing in, she had to jump herself, breaking her pelvis, but living. Irene was later rescued but died from severe burns. Their father, Herman, had stepped out moments before the fire began and never returned. Many members of the crew stayed at their posts despite knowing the danger. Helmsman Lau died in the lower fin. Radio operator Willie Speck kept sending messages until he was overtaken by flames. Rigger Ludwig nor jumped at the last possible second and survived with heavy burns. In the crew areas on deck, Max Schultz, the beloved bartender, was likely cleaning the smoking lounge when the fire started. Kubas said he had seen Schultz wiping the bar only minutes earlier after serving his last drinks. When the flames came, Schultz was trapped. He may have been knocked down by the sudden tilt or overcome by thick smoke. The 60-year-old bartender never made it out. His remains were found in the wreckage, and his death certificate said only that he died in the Zeppelin explosion. Severe burns. When the flames finally sank into the field at Lakehurst, the world expected nothing but death. Yet, when the smoke thinned, something strange appeared through the haze. People were crawling out of the wreck. Some limped, some stumbled, and some walked as if pulled back from the edge of another world. Out of 97 souls on board, 62 survived. On the ground, one Navy crewman was killed when wreckage fell over him. In all, 36 lives were lost, and many more carried broken bones and memories they would never shake for the rest of their days. Even in that horror, brave hands moved without hesitation. Navy men who had been frozen for a breath by the sight snapped back into action. They rushed straight into the fire to pull out the living. Chief Petty Officer Frederick Bull Tobin roared, "Navy men, stand fast," and his crew obeyed, dragging survivors out as explosions cracked around them. Fire crews and medics arrived within minutes. People were fed to the base infirmary and local hospitals as fast as bodies could be lifted. Through the terror, there were moments of almost unbelievable courage. One of the most astonishing stories belonged to a boy who was not supposed to make it out at all. His name was Vera Fr., the 14-year-old cabin boy whose job that evening was simple. Clean up the officer's mess, stack dishes, and hope the weather cleared so he might get shore leave. When the landing alarm rang at about 7:15, he kept working. He whipped down tables and filled the cupboard with dishes. Then he heard a dull thud behind him. The floor shivered. That was the port rope hitting the ground. The lights blinked out, and an instant later, the whole ship jerked upward with the tail rising sharply. All the plates he had just stacked burst out of the cupboard and smashed across the floor. Vera stepped into the keel corridor to see what had happened, and the sight almost froze him where he stood. Far down the gangway, a ball of fire was racing toward him. The entire stern was engulfed and the flames were tearing through the hydrogen cells. Heat blasted through the corridor. Vera stumbled backward up the steepening catwalk, grabbing at ropes as the ship tilted even higher. His feet slipped for a second. He felt himself sliding toward the fire, and he clung to anything he could reach. Later, he admitted he was sure his life would end right there. Then fate dropped something on him that saved him. A ballast tank mounted above him ripped loose as the structure folded in on itself. Hundreds of gallons of water came loose and crashed down. The torrent soaked him completely and shocked him awake. It also coated his clothes enough to shield him from the worst of the heat rolling forward. Airship historian John Proven once said that Vera had been in the only place in the ship where such a miracle could happen. Directly under a tank that burst at the perfect instant. Now dripping wet and able to think again, Vera remembered something important. There was a small provisioning hatch up ahead in the starboard side of the keel. It was a narrow square opening used to load supplies. He tried to climb toward it, but the ship's angle was still too steep. He had to cling to a rope and wait for the bow to tilt downward again. When the ship finally dipped, giving him a few feet of level ground, he lurched forward. He reached the hatch, braced himself, and kicked it open with both feet. The cover flew outward. Below him, the ground was rushing closer, maybe 20 feet away. Vera jumped. For a moment, he felt the ship rising behind him again. The bow had bounced on impact, giving the boy a split second to move before the burning shell dropped down again. On instinct, he remembered his training: never run with the wind. The flames were blowing in the direction of his fall, so spun around and sprinted upwind under the hull. Only seconds later, the rest of the airship collapsed. Exactly where he would have been. Had he run with the wind, the fire would have caught him. He stumbled out from under the falling wreck, dripping, bruised, and shaking. He checked his body in disbelief. He had no burns, no broken bones, just wet skin and pounding breath. Wet, but alive, those were his first words. After escaping, the stunned teenager helped throw water on the remaining fires. The next day, he walked back to the smoldering skeleton of the ship with Lieutenant George Watson. He wanted one thing: his pocket watch. It was a gift from his grandfather, and he had kept it with his belongings in the officers' mess. Picking his way through the charred debris, he found it exactly where he had left it, scorched but still whole. He also grabbed a small piece of aluminum framing as a keepsake. Many years later, he would show that slightly warped watch to reporters as proof that his story happened exactly as he remembered it. People often called his escape the most unlikely of all. Airship historian John Proven said with awe that Vera survived the crash without a scratch. Something few could believe after seeing the footage. Vera never bragged. He always said it was luck, training, and that sudden waterfall from above. In the years that followed, he answered letters from anyone who asked about